Hi everybody, welcome back. It's December 18th. We're a week away from Christmas. So how appropriate that this next whiskey we're going to have is named after a guy who's kind of like Santa Claus. Except instead of bringing presents, he brought liquor. Instead of taking some milk and cookies, he took a whole lot of illicit money. And instead of leaving coal for bad folks, he might murder you. We're talking about George Remus, the king of bootleggers. George Remus Bourbon, aside from having one of the ugliest labels on the market, is known for being the only bourbon, or at least the only line of bourbons that are directly produced and then marketed by MGP. I think it's Multi-Grain Producers of Indiana, I think is what their name was for a really long time. They recently changed to Ross and Squibb, just kind of a weird one, but for whatever reason, they did, and they release whiskey under the George Remus brand when it's their own whiskey. And I'll get a little more into that after we pour this and let it set. MGP, they're mostly known for making whiskey that they source to other people to bottle and sell, and sometimes age. So there are a lot of brands that you might have, that you've certainly heard of, that at one point in time, if not still today, have used MGP whiskey. So George Dickel, for their rye, they use MGP rye. It's not distilled at Cascade Hollow like all the other George Dickel products. Bullet, I think for a while, for one or both of their whiskeys, used MGP. And then there are other brands that will routinely source either from MGP exclusively or from different sources, and then blend them together to make the bourbon or the rye that you're drinking. And one way, really the main way that you can know whether you're actually drinking MGP whiskey is to look at the back of the bottle and see who distilled it. Specifically, you want to look at where it came from, because it should say where it was bottled, where it was distilled. This is in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, which I believe is where MGP is located. And that alone is going to let you know that, okay, this is an MGP product. And I don't know why they went with George Remus as the name of their flagship bourbon, but he was a really successful bootlegger, and my understanding is he was a really bad guy. He was kind of like an Al Capone type, but more specific to bourbon. So George Remus. There you go. This bottle of whiskey right here, the George Remus straight bourbon whiskey, it's 94 proof, so 47% ABV, and it specifies here, which is pretty cool, that it's non-chill filter. So I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but there are some whiskey producers, whether it's bourbon, rye, scotch, anything, they will chill filter their whiskey to make it more palatable, make it easier to drink, make it smoother, right? The problem is when you do that, it takes away a lot of the things within the whiskey that give it a little bit more complexity, maybe give it a little bit more bite. So yeah, in some circumstances, you're going to make it easier to drink, but when you're smoothing it out, that's really what you're doing. You're kind of rounding out the edges, and those edges are flavor. Sometimes it's bad flavor, but most often if you're drinking good enough bourbon to drink, in my opinion, you want to have the uncut, unfiltered version. So I think it's pretty cool that they do that, especially with their base product. This bourbon is going to run you back a little bit more than a lot of the other ones that we've had. I think this is like $40 a bottle before tax, which isn't too crazy at all, but it's starting to get up there. It's maybe a little bit more expensive than you would expect for the entry-level bourbon that's being marketed and sold directly from the people who are making it. Let's see if it's worth it. On the nose, I get oh, it's almost like there's age on it, like sweet oak. I think is the sweet oak and some rye spices. The first thing, those are the first things that I pick up on. It's really good. I really like the smell of that bourbon a lot. You might be able to Google around and figure out what the rumored age is, but there's nothing stated on here. So we know it's straight bourbon whiskey, so it has to be at least 2 years old, but this smells like it's a lot older than 2 years. Yeah, I really like that. All right, let's give it a taste. So I don't think there's a direct one-to-one on the nose to the palate. I'm having a hard time sussing it out. Let me see. I don't get fruity notes on this. Like we talked about the Buffalo Trace being grapey, the 1792 from yesterday having some cherry to it, and then maybe into some like bubblegum or banana. Nothing like that on this, in my opinion. I get darker notes, like again, like sweet oak, maybe some tobacco, and then that rye spice, but it's definitely not leaning toward that mint or piney rye spice at all. Definitely more toward the baking spice, but not really strong, just enough to give some prickliness. I think sweet oak and baking spice is probably the best way I would describe this. I really like this. The viscosity on it's pretty good too, and maybe I'm just in my head from it being non-chill filtered. Maybe that triggered for me like, oh, this feels a little bit thicker, better mouthfeel, better viscosity, but I do think it has it. I really like this. I think it's different than any of the bourbons that we've had so far. It's different than most bourbons that I've had, period. And it's kind of a thinker. Like you can drink it and kind of pick up on different notes, I think, that you're getting on the nose, on the palate as you go, which I really like. I mean, I'm a whiskey geek. I'm into that sort of thing. So I really enjoy being able to kind of, struggle almost with what I'm experiencing, but in a good way. Just struggle and try to figure it out. If you like this too, man, it's hard to recommend a specific MGP product because most of them are sourced. And because most of them are sourced, other people are buying it from MGP. A lot of them are more expensive too. So what I'd recommend is if you're going to the store, just look around for bottles in your price range that maybe you heard a good thing about. And if it says Indiana on it, that it's from Indiana, specifically Lawrenceburg, or if it says it's from Indiana, really, that's almost guaranteed to be MGP. Give it a try, see if you like it. But if you really like this in particular, this specific flavor profile, and you want to step it up, you're willing to look a little bit more, and you're willing to spend, at this point, probably a lot more, you just go up the line and you get the Remus Repeal Reserve. This is the Big Daddy version of this bottle right here. This is the 5th in the series. This came out a few months ago. It is still rolling out in some stores. This is one of my absolute favorite bourbons. It's delicious, the bottle's beautiful, and it is a combination of just really old bourbons, like older than you find in most blends. So let's see, the oldest bourbon, this was bottled in 2021, and the oldest bourbon in here was barreled in 05, so 16 years old, and the youngest was barreled in 08. 13-year-old. So this is a minimum of 13-year-old bourbon, and it's all pretty high rye content. The lowest rye content of any of the 5 bourbons that were blended in this is 21%, which is quite a bit. And I believe, I tasted this before and tasting this one tonight, I think it's the same. It follows the same general principle, that this I think is a higher rye as well. It kind of matches some of the flavor profiles of this one, like quite a bit actually. And so I really do think this is almost like a more quality, higher age version of this guy right here. So if you like this, I definitely think you'll like this. If you can find it, hit me up. I know a store or two that might have it. But you're looking, I think, at like 85 or 90 before tax for this one, but it is worth it. And if you try to buy one of these online, you will be lucky to get it for under $200 before tax. So really good bourbon, really good bourbon. Really enjoyed this. Hope you did too. I'll see you tomorrow. Cheers.